A decorated veteran came home from war only to face a darker battlefield, bankruptcy, betrayal, and the wife who walked away. Alone in the freezing Appalachians with nothing but a backpack and his German shepherd Max, he was ready to surrender to the wilderness. But when the dog's frantic barking led him to a half-collapsed cabin, everything changed. Inside those broken walls began a fight, not just for shelter, but for his soul. Storms, wild predators, and memories of war would test them both. Yet what rose from the ruins shocked even him. Stay with us, because the ending will leave you breathless. And tell me, what city are you listening from today? Ethan Walker carried himself like a man who had been asked too many times to survive. At 40, he was still broad-shouldered, his height a quiet inheritance from a line of mountain men who had split rails and carried rifles before him. But his posture sagged slightly, as if invisible weight pressed down across his collarbones. His face bore the marks of both discipline and fatigue, cheekbones sharp beneath skin, tanned unevenly by desert suns, jaw outlined by the scratch of 2-day stubble, a nose bent ever so slightly from a break that had healed without a doctor's hand. A faint scar traced along his left temple into his hairline, a pale souvenir from a moment of shrapnel he never spoke about. But it was his eyes that told the whole story. Steel gray and restless, they never rested in one place long, scanning doors, windows, the corners of ceilings. He did not choose this vigilance. It had been carved into him, layer by layer, during years of patrols in Afghanistan. At his side moved Max, his 5-year-old German shepherd. Max was the color of harvest fields, a golden-brown base stitched with a black saddle that draped across his back. His ears were tall and alert, his chest deep, and his eyes carried that peculiar intelligence that makes some dogs look as though they are halfway to speech. Max had once been trained to detect explosives. Even now he paused at every sudden sound, nose working, body taut, before deciding the world was safe. For Ethan, Max was not simply a pet. He was comrade, shadow, and lifeline, the only constant in a life that had unraveled the moment Ethan stepped off the plane in North Carolina. When Ethan returned to Asheville, he thought he might rebuild some kind of ordinary life. The city was a strange blend of mountain grit and tourist charm, bluegrass drifting from bars, art galleries tucked beside old brick warehouses, the Blue Ridge Mountains rising like watchmen on the horizon. He found work quickly enough at a construction site. Years before his deployment, he had framed houses, roofed sheds, and read blueprints well enough to earn respect. Now, he was just one of many men chasing day wages, swinging hammers under the gray sky. Rick Dalton, the site foreman, was the kind of man who had been built out of timber and hard winters. Late 50s, hair silvered at the temples, beard cut short, he wore his flannel tucked into a tool belt as if it were a uniform. His forearms bore scars of a lifetime of lumber and nails, and his blue eyes were steady, practical, a weathered winter sky. He gave Ethan a chance without ceremony. 2 weeks' trial, he said, voice blunt but not unkind. Show me you can work, you stay. It was the most mercy a man like Rick offered, honest labor in exchange for honest sweat. Ethan worked like he was trying to outrun memory. He carried beams until his shoulders ached, measured and cut until the tape grew warm in his hand. The rhythm of labor steadied him, though the sharper staccato of nail guns still lanced through his nerves like tracer fire. Each time, Max, tied to the fence at the site's edge, would lift his head, eyes fixed on Ethan, anchoring him. When the world blurred into desert dust and echoes of explosions, Ethan found his way back by laying his palm on Max's fur later, when the day was done. The dog's heartbeat was louder than ghosts. For a little while, it seemed possible that Ethan could make this life hold. But war leaves debts no paycheck can pay, and his other battles were waiting. At night, he returned to the small rental house he had once shared with his wife, Sarah. The house had been painted yellow years earlier, the color chosen for hope, but the paint had faded to the pallor of old parchment. The porch sagged. The grass was patchy and brown with neglect. Inside, silence lived in every corner. The dining table stood bare. The couch sagged without a second weight upon it. Even the walls seemed to know they had lost the laughter of a child. Sarah had been the kind of woman who drew eyes when she entered a room, not because she demanded attention, but because she seemed to embody light. 36 years old, tall and willowy, she carried herself with the confident poise of her profession as a real estate agent. Her auburn hair was tied neatly for work, but she left rebellious strands loose to soften her face. Her skin was fair, dotted with freckles across her nose, and her green eyes had once brimmed with curiosity and faith in the future. When she smiled, people believed her. That talent had sold homes and, for a long time, kept Ethan believing too. They had met young, when Ethan still had a clean-shaven jaw and dreams big enough to touch. Sarah fell in love with the steadiness in him. He admired her ability to walk into empty rooms and imagine families filling them. But years of distance and deployments gnawed away at their foundation. Ethan came back from war changed, scarred not only in body, but in spirit. He startled at loud noises. He shut down in crowded rooms. At night, his nightmares left him drenched in sweat, staring at ceilings as if they might collapse. Sarah tried, cooking warm meals, lighting softer lamps, encouraging therapy. But she, too, carried her own exhaustion. Fear had moved into the house beside her, and no amount of kindness could evict it. The breaking point came quietly. One evening, after another week where Ethan had sat wordless at the kitchen table, drowning in foreclosure notices and medical bills, Sarah folded her hands and said what had been building for months. "I can't raise Lily in a war zone, Ethan. I can't live with someone who's already halfway gone." Her voice was calm, her eyes soft but resolute. She loved him still, but love had become a rope frayed by time and weight. The next morning she packed bags. She took their daughter Lily, bright-eyed at 10 years old, freckles dusting her cheeks, her gray eyes mirroring her father's. Lily loved Max fiercely, hugging him so hard the dog leaned into her with sighs of delight, but even that tether wasn't enough to keep her. Sarah drove to her sister's house in Raleigh. Ethan stood on the porch, Max at his feet, and watched the taillights dissolve into distance. The silence that followed was worse than any explosion he had endured. Then came the letter from the bank. Foreclosure. 30 days. The house was no longer his. The walls that had once cradled his family would soon cradle strangers. He met with Mr. Halpern, a loan officer with neat hair and smoother words, who offered sympathy without substance. "We're constrained by policy," Halpern said, as though policy were a storm no one could fight. Ethan nodded, because what else could he do? Some battles you don't win, you just survive their verdict. When the day came, Deputy Carla Ruiz arrived to tape the notice to his door. She was compact and strong, dark hair braided tight, eyes steady with the kind of compassion that does not weaken duty. "You got a place to go?" she asked. Ethan touched Max's collar. "We've got the truck," he said. She nodded, touched the brim of her hat, and left him the dignity of silence. He packed what he could. Tools went first, hammer, saw, drills, because a man never abandons the instruments of his trade. Clothes folded into a single duffel. A school photo of Lily, gap-toothed smile captured in time. That was all. Max leapt into the passenger seat with the grace of a soldier returning to formation. Ethan shut the door behind him without locking it. It no longer belonged to him. Gratitude was his final act. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty rooms, because even grief deserves acknowledgement. That night they slept in the pickup behind a hardware store. The owner, an old man in a red cap with a jaw like stubborn stone, allowed it without question. "Don't make a mess," he muttered, which in his language meant, I'll give you this mercy, though I can't say it out loud." Ethan spread a blanket across the truck bed. Max curled close, warm and constant, ears twitching at every passing car. Ethan stared up at the headliner of the cab, whispering promises to himself like a father telling bedtime stories. Tomorrow, another job. Tomorrow, another day to keep moving. He reached for Max's ear, rubbed the velvet skin between his fingers, and said, "It's you and me now. We've been worse off and we'll be better armed." The dog sighed, eyes half closed, content because for him the world was no larger than the space they shared. Ethan closed his eyes and let exhaustion claim him. Outside, Asheville hummed with the unseen lives of strangers. Beyond the city lights, the Appalachians waited, dark ridges older than memory, holding within them 100 forgotten cabins where men had once disappeared to rebuild or vanish altogether. Ethan did not know yet that one of those cabins would soon call to him, offering not just shelter, but a chance to rise again. For now he slept in the quiet company of his dog, the last and truest soldier still standing at his side. The days blurred together in a rhythm that barely deserved to be called life. Ethan Walker woke each morning cramped in the cab of his old pickup, his knees aching from hours bent against the steering wheel. Max curled tight against the passenger door like a sentinel who never really slept. They drove from town to town across western North Carolina, searching for day work, odd jobs that paid just enough for gas and fast food. It was survival by inches, a balancing act where a single bad week could mean hunger. Max adjusted more easily than Ethan. The German shepherd's coat had thickened in the cold, glossy along the black saddle and golden at his legs and flanks. He carried himself like a soldier still on duty, head lifted, ears forward, eyes sharp at every sound of diesel engines in the truck stops. When Ethan's despair made his shoulders fold, Max leaned his warm body against him, a wordless insistence that one more mile could always be managed. The truck stops were their temporary villages. Lines of 18-wheelers idled like metal beasts, exhaling clouds of gray breath into the night. Ethan and Max often slept among them, the air thick with the smell of fuel, fried food, and loneliness. Truckers came and went, men with weather-beaten faces, their bodies thickened by years of sitting behind wheels, their voices gravelly with tobacco and road dust. One man who stood out was Cal Diesel Rourke, a long-haul driver Ethan met one evening while refilling his thermos at a gas station counter. Diesel was in his late 50s, heavy-set, with arms thick as tree trunks, a beard salt and pepper but mostly ash, and a faded tattoo of a winged skull on his left forearm. His eyes were pale blue and rimmed with permanent exhaustion, yet they carried a gentleness unexpected in a man so large. Years of the road had worn him down, but a bad back injury from a highway accident made him softer toward strays, whether animals or people. He noticed Max first. "Fine-looking shepherd," Diesel said, tipping his trucker cap back. "Looks like he'd pull me out of a wreck if I asked him." Ethan managed a faint smile. He'd try. Diesel studied Ethan's face, the scar at his temple, the eyes that never quite settled. He saw enough to guess without asking. "War, huh?" Ethan didn't answer, but the silence spoke. Diesel gave a short nod, as if granting permission for Ethan to keep his secrets. "Well, son, the road's hard, but it's still road. Beats staying still when stillness'll kill you." He poured coffee, handed Ethan a cup, and added, "First one's on me. Soldiers don't pay tonight." It was a small kindness, but kindness carries weight when the world has gone lean. Ethan drank the bitter liquid, Max at his feet, and for a moment the endless noise of despair quieted. Still, those nights in the truck stop lots pressed down heavy. The laughter of strangers, the calls of televisions in diners, the endless movement of people who belonged somewhere, all of it sharpened Ethan's sense of dislocation. His mind returned again and again to Sarah and Lily. He imagined Lily's freckles, her small hand tangled in Max's fur, and the way she laughed at things no one else noticed. Each memory was a knife sharpened by love. Some nights the darkness brought darker thoughts. Ethan would stare at the roof of the cab, his breath clouding the glass, and wonder if there was any point in driving further. War had taken his peace, debt had taken his house, and grief had taken his family. What remained? He thought about ending it, about finding some way to let go, but Max would stir against him, pressing his muzzle into Ethan's hand, as if refusing permission. It was impossible to abandon someone who refused to abandon you. On a night colder than the rest, frost silvered the truck's windshield. They had driven out of town, following a 2-lane road that curled toward the Smoky Mountains, where the peaks loomed like sleeping giants beneath the starlight. Ethan parked at a turnout along the highway. Pines closed in on both sides, their branches whispering in the wind. The silence here was deeper, the kind that pressed against the ears until you heard your own heart. Ethan rubbed his hands together for warmth, his breath white in the cab. Max curled tighter, his body a living furnace. Ethan stared into the darkness until memory began to flicker, voices from another time, another battlefield. He remembered Sergeant Daniel O'Leary, his squad leader, a man with a jaw like carved oak and a grin that had once been called indestructible. O'Leary had been a father figure in the dust, quick with crude jokes, but also with stories that reminded young soldiers there was still a world beyond the desert. One story returned now, rising unbidden from the fog of exhaustion. O'Leary had spoken of old hunting cabins scattered through the Appalachian Mountains, relics left behind by miners and trappers in the 1940s and 50s. Places no one bothers with anymore, O'Leary had said during a lull in gunfire, cleaning his rifle with casual precision. If a man ever needed to disappear, to breathe without the world breathing down his neck, he could find one of those cabins and make it his kingdom. At the time, Ethan had laughed. A kingdom of rotten wood and squirrels hardly seemed worth dreaming of. But now, sitting in his truck with nowhere to go, the memory carried the weight of prophecy. A ruined cabin in the mountains, remote, forgotten, sounded less like fantasy and more like salvation. He looked down at Max, who had opened his eyes as if sensing his master's thoughts. The dog's gaze was steady, brown eyes reflecting the faint light from the dashboard. Ethan stroked the ridge of Max's head, fingers catching on the soft velvet of his ears. "Maybe we ought to go looking, boy," he whispered. "Find one of those places the world forgot. What do you think?" Max blinked slowly, tail thumping once against the seat. The gesture was answer enough. Ethan leaned back against the seat, watching the dark outline of the Smokies. For the first time in weeks, something stirred inside him that was not despair. It was not quite hope, but it was close enough to make him breathe differently. Perhaps a cabin still stood somewhere in those ridges, waiting for hands willing to rebuild it. Perhaps he could find a home again, even if it was nothing more than 4 walls and a roof that leaked. That night, as the cold wrapped tighter around the cab, Ethan allowed himself to imagine it, chopping firewood, patching old timber, sleeping under a roof he had raised with his own hands. Max running free through snowdrifts, barking at deer on the ridges, guarding the door against everything Ethan feared. It was a picture so vivid that, for a moment, he believed it. He pulled the blanket tighter, closed his eyes, and whispered one final promise to the dog curled against him. "Tomorrow, Max, we'll start looking tomorrow." The road narrowed as Ethan guided the old pickup deeper into Cherokee National Forest. Pines rose like ancient sentries on either side, their trunks arrow-straight, their crowns whispering together in the thin mountain wind. The higher he drove, the thinner the traffic became, until the only company was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Max leaned forward on the passenger seat, his paws planted firmly, nose pressed against the glass as though he were drinking in every scent. The German shepherd's coat caught the light through the windshield, black along the spine, golden along the flanks. His tail wagged in bursts, then stilled, then wagged again. He seemed to know something awaited them higher up, something worth his vigilance. The road soon gave way to a dirt track, rough and rutted from years of neglect. Twice Ethan had to stop and drag fallen branches from the path. Once the truck's engine coughed with heat, and he waited beside it, hood open, the cold mountain air stinging his face. Max ranged around the clearing during those stops, ears pricked, each step full of alert energy. It was as if the dog had been waiting his whole life to climb into wilderness. The forest thinned at last, and a meadow unfolded before them, sloping down to a line of aspen trees whose white trunks shone ghost-like in the fading light. Beyond them, the land fell away sharply, opening into a valley, and on the far side rose the snow-capped shoulders of higher peaks. Ethan slowed the truck to a crawl, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in a long time, anticipation unsharpened by dread. And then he saw it. At the far end of what must once have been a cluster of minor cabins, now reduced to nothing but stone foundations and rotted timbers, one structure still stood. Its roof sagged like a weary spine. Windows gaped broken and black. The porch had collapsed halfway, and vines crept across the front wall like veins. A pine tree had grown too close, its branches thrusting boldly through one shattered window. Yet the log walls, thick and time-darkened, still held their shape. Against the ruin all around, this cabin was a stubborn survivor. Ethan cut the engine. The sudden silence seemed to roar. Max bounded from the truck the instant the door opened, his bark sharp in the crisp air. He ran circles around the cabin, nose to the ground, tail slicing the air like a flag. At the front steps, such as they were, he stopped and pawed at the earth with a determination that sent dirt flying. He barked again, the sound reverberating through the valley. Ethan stood watching, a faint, tired smile softening his scar-lined face. "You think so too, huh?" The place was a wreck, no denying it. But his eyes, trained by years of construction before the war, stripped away vines and rot, the way a doctor looks past blood to bone. The foundation stones were unmortared, but solid, fitted so tightly together they had withstood decades of freeze and thaw. The logs themselves, beneath the moss, were thick and straight, their cores likely untouched by decay. The roof would need replacing, the porch too, but the skeleton was strong. Ethan walked slowly around the cabin, running his hand over rough bark turned to timber, listening to the creak of his boots in the damp ground. He inhaled deeply. The air smelled of pine sap, wet earth, and old wood, a perfume of persistence. This wasn't a place that had been abandoned. It was a place that had been waiting. A rustle in the brush drew his attention. Max had flushed a rabbit, and the dog froze, muscles taut, eyes fixed, but did not chase. Instead, he turned back to Ethan, waiting, tail wagging once, as though the discovery of prey was less important than the confirmation of his master's approval. Ethan crouched and rubbed the dog's ears. "Good boy. We're not here to hunt. We're here to build." He walked up to the porch. The boards groaned under his weight, one snapping at the edge, but he kept moving. Inside, the cabin was dim and smelled of mildew, but sunlight leaked through broken windows, catching dust motes in golden shafts. A stone fireplace still stood at one end, its chimney climbing straight and true. In the corner, a rusted iron stove leaned like a relic of another family's survival. Birds scattered from the rafters as he entered, wings clattering in panic. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, his breath echoing softly. He closed his eyes for a moment and tried to imagine what it could become. The fireplace burning with clean-cut logs, the roof tight against winter snow, a bed in the corner, blankets folded neat. Max curled before the fire, chest rising and falling in the safety of sleep. For the first time in months, Ethan's imagination didn't collapse under the weight of impossibility. A sound startled him, the distant putter of an approaching engine. He turned, heart-jerking, old reflexes instantly awake. A vehicle eased around the curve of the dirt track, and soon a battered green Jeep appeared, its paint dulled, its fenders dented from long use. Behind the wheel sat a man in his late 60s. The stranger parked and climbed out with the stiffness of age. He was lean and wiry, his face tanned like leather, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. A gray beard sprouted unevenly across his chin, trimmed more by pocket-knife than barber. His eyes were a pale, watchful blue, the eyes of someone who had lived most of his life outdoors. His jacket was canvas, patched at the elbows, his boots scuffed, his hands calloused. He raised one hand in greeting. "Didn't think I'd see anyone out here." His voice rasped with years of smoke and weather, but there was no menace in it, only curiosity. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Just passing through. Saw the cabin." The man smiled faintly. "Name's Hank Grady. Been hunting these woods near on 40 years. That place. There, folks used to call it Lawson's Cabin. Old mining family built it back when men still dug silver out of these hills. Last Lawson died in the 50s, far as I recall. Since then, it's been a home for squirrels and snow." Max trotted forward, sniffing Hank's boots. The old man bent stiffly, scratched the dog's head with a familiarity earned by 1,000 hunting dogs before. "Fine shepherd you got. Smart eyes." "His name's Max," Ethan said quietly. Hank nodded. "Figures. Dogs like him don't need fancy names. They just need work." He straightened, surveying Ethan's stance, his worn boots, the scar at his temple. "You planning to do something with the place?" "Thinking about it," Ethan admitted. "Foundation's solid." "Roof's shot," Hank said, nodding toward the sagging beams. "But you've got the look of a man who knows how to fix more than a roof." He eyed Ethan for a moment, then shrugged. "Well, no law against squatting in an old ruin. Long as you don't leave a mess, nobody in these parts is likely to chase you off. Hell, most folks won't even know you're here." With that, he gave Max one more pat, climbed back into his Jeep, and rumbled away, leaving Ethan and the dog in the gathering quiet. Ethan stood for a long moment, watching the Jeep vanish down the track. Hank's words rang in his ears. "No law against squatting. Nobody will know you're here." The phrases sounded less like warnings than invitations. He looked back at the cabin. The vines, the broken windows, the collapsed porch. It was ruin, yes, but it was also possibility. He imagined the eyes of people in town, eyes that measured him by what he had lost rather than what he might yet build. Here there would be no eyes, only the forest, the mountains, and Max. Ethan ran his palm along one of the timbers. Rough, cold, real. He felt his shoulders square, his spine straighten. The cabin was broken, but it wasn't finished. Neither was he. He crouched beside Max, who was still sniffing around the steps, tail swinging like a banner. "You were right, boy," he murmured. "This could be home." Max barked once, sharp and eager, then began digging again at the base of the porch, as though to prove the point. Dirt flew, paws scuffing with enthusiasm. Ethan laughed, an unexpected, rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. He rose, looked out across the meadow, and then back to the cabin. Decision settled in his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. He would stay. He would build. The forest exhaled around him, branches swaying, as though the mountains themselves approved. The first morning, Ethan woke inside the ruined cabin, his breath curled in the air like smoke. Frost rimmed the inside of the broken windows, and the thin blanket he had pulled over himself did little to block the mountain's knife-edged cold. Max had slept pressed against him, the dog's thick coat radiating warmth, his steady breathing the only sound in the cavernous quiet. When Ethan opened his eyes, Max lifted his head, ears pricked, as if already alert to a day's worth of duties. Outside, the Cherokee forest was glazed in pale sunlight, the kind that gave no heat. Ethan pushed open the warped door and stepped into a world that felt ancient. Snow lay in pockets across the meadow, the earth frozen hard beneath. His boots crunched with each step. He looked back at the cabin. A husk, yes, but one with bones still strong enough to stand against winter's weight. He rubbed his scarred hands together, his breath white in the cold. "We start today, boy," he said. Max wagged his tail as if in agreement. Ethan began with the roof. The sagging beams threatened collapse with each gust of wind. He hauled out his toolbox, hammer, handsaw, nails scavenged from his truck, and set to work. The old shingles crumbled like ash beneath his gloves, but the beams beneath, though weathered, held firm. He pried away rusted tin sheets, balanced carefully along the ridge, while Max trotted below, circling, barking now and then as though cheering him on. Each thud of hammer echoed through the silent trees, a defiance to the wilderness. The work was brutal in the cold, and by mid-afternoon his arms shook from strain. Sweat froze on his skin, stiffening the fabric of his flannel. But with every board fitted, every nail driven, a strange energy filled him, the old rhythm of construction he had once known in Denver, back when his company was thriving and Sarah still believed in him. The memory twisted inside him, but instead of breaking him, it gave him resolve. He was not finished. Neither was this cabin. To seal the walls, Ethan returned to a trick he had read about in survival guides and once seen used in old Appalachian buildings, a mixture of mud and moss chinking. He trudged into the meadow with a shovel, Max bounding at his side, and gathered what earth he could. His gloves smeared brown-green paste between the logs, pressing it into gaps that had once been filled by men long dead. Each handful was a promise against the cold. Max sat close, watching every motion, occasionally sniffing at the mud as if trying to judge whether it was good enough. By dusk, Ethan's hands were raw, nails lined with dirt, but the walls held warmth better. The cabin glowed faintly with a fire he had coaxed into the old stone hearth. The flames cracked, sending sparks into the chimney, and for the first time in weeks, the air in his lungs felt alive rather than stolen. He built a crude bed frame from scavenged timber, laid his blanket over it, and lay down with Max, stretched across the foot like a sentry who never abandoned his post. The next days fell into rhythm. Ethan rose at dawn, fed Max from a bag of kibble that was rapidly thinning, and set to work. He replaced broken window frames with boards scavenged from collapsed structures nearby and nailed up heavy canvas for insulation. He found an old wood stove half buried in leaves behind the cabin, its surface rusted but solid, and dragged it inside. Cleaning and setting it into place nearly broke his back, but once the first fire burned inside, it heated the room more efficiently than the open hearth. Occasionally he made trips down the mountain to the small town of Bryson City. The hardware store there was owned by a wiry old man named Pete McAllister. Pete was 70 if a day, short and stooped, his back bent from decades of lifting boxes heavier than he should have. His hair was white and thin, sticking out from beneath a battered cap embroidered with the words, "Proud to be Appalachian." His eyes were bright blue, sharp as nails, and his tongue was equally sharp. When Ethan first walked in, clothes stained with mud, beard rough with neglect, Pete gave him a slow once-over. "You look like hell," he said bluntly. "But hell or not, money spends the same." Then he noticed Max, who sat squarely at Ethan's side, ears perked. Pete bent down with a grunt of stiff knees and scratched the dog behind the ears. "Fine animal. Smarter than most men come in here." Ethan bought roofing tin, nails, and a coil of rope, paying with the last of his savings. Pete didn't ask many questions. Mountain people learned long ago that questions were often unwelcome. But when Ethan mentioned the old Lawson cabin, Pete's eyebrows lifted. That place? Thought it had fallen down years ago? He shook his head, half amused. Well, if you've got the guts to fix it, you might just make it livable. But mind the bears. They wander this time of year, looking for what they can. Ethan nodded. The warning lodged itself in the back of his mind, like a nail waiting for the right hammer. Back at the cabin, he worked until his muscles screamed. Max never left his side. The dog guarded him while he sawed, barked at deer that ventured too close, and curled tight against him at night when the temperature plunged below freezing. Ethan began to think of Max not just as a companion, but as his second set of senses, his eyes and ears, when his own mind drifted into memory or fatigue. One night, the truth of that bond saved him. Ethan had fallen asleep in his new bed frame, exhausted from a day of hauling beams. The fire in the stove glowed low, casting red patterns on the cabin walls. Max lay near the door, his favorite position, chin resting on his paws. Sometime past midnight, a deep growl rumbled from the dog's chest. It was not the playful sound of dream chasing, but a warning pulled from the marrow of his bones. Ethan stirred awake, instantly alert. He knew that sound. He had trusted it in deserts half a world away, when Max had alerted them to hidden danger. He grabbed his flashlight, heart pounding, and rose quietly. Max's body was rigid, ears pointed toward the corner of the cabin where the small shed stood outside. The growl deepened, a thunder in miniature. Ethan opened the door slowly, the cold slapping him awake. He swept the beam of light across the meadow, and his breath caught. A massive black bear stood at the shed, its broad shoulders hunched, muzzle deep in the wooden boards as it pawed through Ethan's makeshift food storage. The bear's fur gleamed dark, its body a mountain of muscle and fat, steam rising from its breath in the freezing night. The shed walls splintered beneath its strength as though they were paper. Ethan's first instinct was to shout, to drive the beast away. He took a step forward, but Max growled louder, pressing his body against Ethan's leg as if to anchor him. The dog's message was clear. Stay inside. The bear was too big, too strong, and hunger made it unpredictable. So Ethan stood frozen, watching through the window as the creature tore through bags of grain and cans of beans, scattering them into the snow. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. Finally, sated or bored, the bear lumbered back into the darkness, leaving devastation behind. When silence returned, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He crouched, pressing his hand into Max's ruff. "You saved me again, boy," he whispered. The dog leaned into him, tail thumping softly once, his eyes steady and calm. In the gray light of morning, Ethan surveyed the wreckage. The shed lay in splinters, food scattered and ruined. The loss stung, supplies were precious, hard-won with his dwindling money. But the greater lesson struck deeper. The mountain was not a tame ally. It demanded respect, vigilance, and humility. He rebuilt the shed that day, this time with heavier boards reinforced with salvaged metal. He stored food in sealed containers, hung others from rafters high beyond a bear's reach. Each motion was a vow to never underestimate the wilderness again. As evening fell, Ethan lit a new fire and sat beside it, Max stretched along the floor at his feet. Outside, the forest creaked and shifted, alive with creatures he might never see but would always have to consider. Ethan rubbed Max's ears, gratitude flooding through him. The dog's instincts had once again pulled him back from danger. The cabin was still far from complete, the work endless, but Ethan felt something new in his chest, a hard-earned respect, not just for the forest, but for the bond between man and dog. Survival here would not come from strength alone. It would come from discipline, from patience, and from listening to the quiet warnings of the loyal friend at his side. January in the Cherokee Mountains came like a slow tightening of a fist. The days shortened, the air turned brittle, and the nights pressed down with a silence that could smother the unprepared. Ethan had been proud of his progress, the patched roof, the sealed walls, the wood stove that breathed steady heat. But the mountains had a way of reminding men that pride was fragile. The storm arrived with no ceremony. One morning the air hung heavy, gray clouds sagging low against the peaks. By afternoon, snow fell in thick, wet sheets, blinding and relentless. Within hours, the meadow outside the cabin had vanished under a white ocean, drifts climbing like tidal waves against the log walls. Wind screamed through the trees, rattling the patched shutters until they threatened to splinter. Ethan moved quickly at first, hauling in extra wood, stuffing rags along the doorframe, securing whatever supplies he had. Max paced restlessly, tail stiff, ears angled toward the storm as though tracking an unseen enemy. The dog's golden-black coat bristled with unease. He hated confinement, but he hated leaving Ethan's side more. By nightfall, the dirt road leading down the mountain was gone, erased by snow and fallen pines. Ethan tested the door, cracking it open against the gale, and saw only a wall of white. His solar panels, already fickle in winter light, iced over and shattered under the weight of sleet. Power vanished. The cabin fell into a darkness broken only by the dull red glow of the wood stove. He rationed what he had: beans, rice, a few cans of soup, jerky for Max. But even those meager supplies dwindled faster than he wanted to admit. Every bite was measured, every swallow counted. He melted snow in an old pot for water, the taste metallic and sharp. His matches were running low, and damp wood hissed in protest before catching flame. The cold was a living thing, creeping through seams, biting at his fingers and toes. At night, when the fire burned low, Ethan lay curled beneath blankets, teeth chattering despite the layers. Max pressed himself against Ethan's chest, paws tucked neatly, body radiating a heat that seemed far larger than his frame. In the darkness, the dog's eyes glowed faintly, wide and unwavering. Ethan stroked his fur, whispering just to fill the silence. "We've been through worse, haven't we, boy?" But his voice cracked on the lie. This was a different kind of war, no enemy to fight, no weapon to wield, just endurance or surrender. On the third day, despair coiled around him. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the frost lacing the inside of the window, and felt his chest hollow with a familiar weight. He thought of Sarah's back as she walked away with Lily, of the foreclosure notice taped to his door, of every hammer strike that had once meant success, now reduced to the hollow echo of loss. A man can only fight so long, he thought. Maybe it was time to stop. Max must have sensed it. The dog climbed onto the bed fully, pressing his solid body against Ethan, resting his head squarely on the man's shoulder. Ethan turned, gray eyes meeting warm brown. The gaze was steady, insistent, as if the animal were speaking in a language older than words. "Don't. I'm here. You're not finished." Tears pricked Ethan's eyes, surprising him. He buried his face in Max's fur, breathing in the smell of smoke, pine, and the faint musk of wilderness. His hands fisted in the dog's ruff. For the first time since the storm began, he slept without nightmares. The blizzard lasted 5 more days. Snow piled to Ethan's waist outside, blocking the shed and burying the path to the creek. Food ran perilously low. He boiled the last of the beans with melted snow, splitting it into 2 bowls, one for himself, one for Max. He chewed slowly, swallowing bitterness along with hunger. One morning he woke to find the fire nearly dead and his woodpile soaked through from a leak he hadn't noticed in the roof patch. He stumbled outside into the screaming wind, axe in hand, and hacked at the fallen branches scattered across the meadow. His fingers burned, then went numb, and each swing of the axe felt like lifting stone. Max trotted beside him, barking encouragement, circling him like a guardian against the storm. Together they dragged back what wood they could, and Ethan coaxed flame from damp splinters with shaking hands. By the seventh day, the storm broke. Sunlight spilled across the mountains, dazzling on endless white slopes. The cabin was half buried, chimney barely visible above the drifts. Ethan shoveled a path until his muscles trembled, Max bounding ahead, leaping joyfully into the snow as if to prove the world had not ended. Inside that night, the fire roared strong, and Ethan sat with Max's head in his lap, staring into the flames. Something inside him had shifted. The storm had stripped him bare, left him with nothing but exhaustion, hunger, and the steady presence of his dog. And in that crucible, he had found an unexpected truth. He was not hiding anymore. For months he had come to the mountains running, from bankruptcy, from Sarah's abandonment, from the ache of Lily's absence, from the noise of a world that measured men only by their failures. But the blizzard gave him no place to run. It forced him to stand, to endure, to face himself. And he had not been alone. Max, loyal sentinel, had been his anchor. The dog had guarded him not just from danger, but from despair. In the bright glow of the fire, Ethan rubbed the thick fur at Max's neck and whispered, "I still matter, because you need me, because we need each other." The cabin walls creaked, snow sliding from the roof, the forest groaning as it shifted under the thaw. Ethan smiled faintly, weary but resolute. He no longer felt like a ghost hiding in ruins. He felt like a man still alive, still capable of building, of protecting, of surviving. The storm had not destroyed him. It had forged him. The Appalachian spring is a quiet miracle. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets, but with whispers. Snowmelt slipping under the crust of ice, the slow unfurling of moss that had lain brittle all winter, the hesitant green haze along aspen branches. Ethan had lived through a storm that nearly stripped him bare, but when the thaw came, he felt the mountain breathe again, and with it, something in his chest loosened. That morning he was splitting firewood behind the cabin. The maul rose and fell in rhythm, a hymn of survival turned into routine. Each crack echoed across the meadow, mingling with the rush of the creek below. His shirt clung to him, damp with sweat despite the lingering chill, and his breath came steady, each exhale visible in the crisp air. Max lay nearby, stretched on a patch of earth newly freed of snow, his head resting on his forepaws, golden black fur catching threads of sunlight. His eyes were half closed, but his ears, always those ears, twitched at every sound. The rhythm broke when Max bolted upright. His tail stiffened, nose twitching, body coiled like a spring. A single warning bark thundered from his chest. Ethan froze, maul poised midair, eyes narrowing. From the aspens at the meadow's edge, a figure appeared. A woman, moving at a measured pace, boots sinking into the wet soil, a hiking staff in one hand. She paused, letting the forest close behind her, and stood there as if waiting to be judged. She raised a hand, palm open. "Morning," she called, her voice low, steady, carrying just enough to be heard over the creek. "Permission to step closer?" Ethan gripped the maul tighter, studying her. He had grown used to solitude, to the mountain silence broken only by Max's bark or the crackle of fire. Strangers no longer belonged in his world. Yet there was nothing in her stance that hinted at threat, no arrogance, no rush, just patience. He lowered the maul. "Come on, then." Max trotted forward to intercept, posture alert but not hostile. The woman stopped, crouched slightly, and held her hand low. She didn't reach for him. She waited. Max sniffed, tail giving a cautious wag before he leaned into her palm. She rubbed under his chin, murmuring something Ethan couldn't hear, and the dog relaxed completely. That was the moment Ethan decided she was safe. She stepped closer. Her parka was red but faded to the color of brick dust, shoulders patched with darker fabric. She wore canvas trousers tucked into boots, scuffed from years of trails, and a wool cap from which strands of steel-gray hair escaped, framing a face marked by sun and wind. Her skin was brown and weather-lined, her eyes a clear hazel green that seemed to see both detail and distance at once. At 60, she stood straight, strong, yet carried the ease of someone who belonged in wild places. "I'm Mary Collins," she said. "Used to be a ranger in these parts. Haven't been up this ridge in years. I thought Lawson's cabin would have collapsed by now. Guess I was wrong." "Ethan Walker," he replied. "This is Max." Mary's eyes softened at the dog's name. "Steady fellow. I like him already." She glanced toward the cabin. "And I like what you've done here. That roof's new tin, isn't it? Walls are freshly chinked. You've put work in." "Trying to make it livable," Ethan said, his voice guarded but not unfriendly. Mary walked a slow circle, keeping respectful distance. She examined the stacked firewood, the barrels Ethan had reinforced after the bear attack, the patched porch posts. Her lips curved in a small, approving smile. "You've turned ruin into a home," she said. Then, tilting her head toward him, "And from the look of you, maybe turned yourself a little too." Ethan felt the words land heavier than he expected. He had spent months clawing against despair, but rarely thought about what it looked like from the outside. "Work helps," he muttered. "Work always does," Mary replied. "Work tells you who you are when you've forgotten." Max returned to Ethan's side, sitting tall, watching Mary with the calm assessment he gave strangers who might someday belong to his pack. His tail wagged once, a seal of trust. Mary set down her pack, a weather-beaten canvas thing with fraying straps, and drew out a canteen. She drank, then offered it without ceremony. Ethan shook his head. She took another sip, wiped her mouth with the back of her glove, then looked at the cabin again. "Back when I was a ranger, rookies used to dream about places like this," she said. By week 2, they learned dreams don't stack wood. By week 3, the smart ones learned humility, or went home. You seem to have stayed past week 3. Ethan chuckled dryly. "Almost didn't. Winter tried to finish me." He told her about the blizzard, about melting snow for water, about nearly surrendering until Max anchored him with his warmth and gaze. He spoke with the flat simplicity of men who have run out of appetite for drama, but Mary listened as though every word was a testimony worth hearing. She nodded when he finished. "Storms are teachers, hard ones but honest. They don't care about your medals or your regrets. They care if you're stubborn enough to learn." There was no pity in her tone, only recognition. Ethan found himself strangely grateful for that. "You a builder?" she asked after a pause. Ran a construction company once." "Then you know something most don't," Mary said. "How to put bones back in wood, how to give shape where there's collapse. That's a gift, Mr. Walker. Too many folks only know how to tear down." Ethan shrugged, but inside something shifted. He had been seeing the cabin only as survival. Mary made it sound like more. From her pack she drew out a small notebook, leather-backed, its corners rounded from years of use. She held it lightly, then extended it toward him. "Here," she said, "blank pages. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and I'd rather listen to birds than scribble their names. You, though, you might want to keep record, not for show, for use. Write down what works, what fails. Roof angles, stove drafts, ways to keep bears out. One day, someone else will need it." Ethan hesitated, then took the notebook. The paper inside was rough, sturdy. He opened to the first blank page and felt the weight of possibility press into his palm. "Write for yourself," Mary continued. "Later, maybe for others. You're not the only one who needed these mountains to breathe again. Plenty of men and women come out of wars, out of divorces, out of losses, and have no idea where to put their hands except in their pockets. They'd do better if they had something like this." Her gaze sharpened. "You could give it to them." Ethan felt Max press against his leg, as if confirming the challenge. The dog looked at Mary, then back at Ethan, tail thumping once. Mary smiled. "Seems your partner agrees." They shared a simple meal before she left. Jerky divided 3 ways, apples from her pack, water cold enough to sting their teeth. She told stories with the timing of someone who had learned the mountain's humor, of city hikers who thought bears were pets until they met one, of storms that tested marriages harder than any vow. Ethan found himself laughing softly, a sound he hadn't heard in months. Max wagged his tail at the sound as if it were music. When Mary rose to go, she slung her pack onto her shoulders with practiced ease. She studied Ethan one last time. "You've got something here," she said. "Not just a roof, a reason. Don't waste it." She bent and pressed her forehead lightly to Max's for a heartbeat, a gesture both intimate and ancient. "You take care of him," she whispered to the dog. Max answered with a soft chuff. Then she walked back toward the aspens, swallowed by green and shadow until only silence remained. Ethan stood long after she disappeared, notebook clutched in his hand. The pages gleamed pale in the dimming light, like untouched snow waiting for tracks. He carried it inside, set it on the table, and sharpened a pencil with his pocket knife. That night, by firelight, he began to write. He wrote not as a ghost recording the remnants of his life, but as a man charting survival into a map. Roof pitches, wood stacking techniques, the lessons of storms and bears. He even wrote about Max, about the dog's warnings, his patience, his companionship. He wrote until the fire sank to embers and Max dozed at his feet. When Ethan finally closed the notebook, a strange warmth filled him, deeper than the fire's glow. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was shaping something for more than himself. By late summer, the forest had shaken off its last traces of snow and stood in its full green majesty. The meadow before the cabin rippled with tall grass, butterflies darting between wildflowers, and the creek sang louder with melted snows feeding its veins. Ethan stood on the porch he had rebuilt with his own hands, wiping sweat from his brow after driving the last nail into a new crossbeam. The cabin looked different now, not a ruin patched together for survival, but a place with purpose. Inside, the table held the notebook Mary had given him, its pages filling fast with neat lines of script. Diagrams of stove vents, notes on wood storage, sketches of Max in different postures, alert, resting, guarding. It was no longer just a record, it was a guide. And somewhere along the way, Ethan realized he was writing it not only for himself, but for others who might come after him. The first of those others arrived sooner than he expected. It was a warm afternoon when Max barked, deep and steady, ears forward at the sound of tires crunching gravel. Ethan stepped into the meadow to see an old Chevy pickup approach, paint dulled to gray, bumper tied with wire. From the cab climbed a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, hair clipped close, jaw shadowed with a beard that had grown without care. His eyes were gray like storm clouds, carrying weight the body couldn't hide. "Walker?" the man called, voice gravelly, uncertain. Ethan narrowed his eyes, studying him. "Yeah, who's asking?" The man approached slowly, raising a hand. "Calvin Miller. We did a rotation together in Helmand. You probably don't remember. I was in Echo Company, ran point 2 valleys over. Heard about you from an old buddy in Asheville. Said you'd gone to ground, found some place up here." Memory stirred, dust, heat, a convoy idling under a foreign sun, a younger man with the same storm-gray eyes, laughing at something crude before they rolled out. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I remember. You made a joke about canned beans being more dangerous than mortars." Calvin's grin was brief, fading into weariness. "Guess I did." His shoulders sagged. "I didn't know where else to go." Ethan studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Then you came to the right place." Max trotted over, sniffing Calvin's boots before circling him once. The dog's gaze softened, and his tail gave a single thump. Acceptance granted. That night they sat by the fire, Calvin hunched in a chair Ethan had built, hands clasped between his knees. He was lean in the way men get when food is an afterthought, skin pale under the beard. His voice, when he spoke, carried gravel, but also fracture lines. Can't sleep right, can't sit still either. Wife left last spring, said she was done living with ghosts. Can't blame her. I don't like living with them either. Ethan listened, saying little. Max padded over and laid his head on Calvin's knee. The man startled, then slowly lifted a hand, tentative, and rested it on the shepherd's thick ruff. For the first time, Calvin's voice steadied. "He gets it, doesn't he?" "He always does," Ethan said. In the days that followed, Ethan showed Calvin the rhythms of the cabin. How to split wood properly, the stance that saved your back. How to angle a roof plank so snow wouldn't crush it. How to breathe in the silence without trying to fill it. Calvin worked hard, sweat soaking his shirt, but at night his hands trembled less. Max often sat beside him in stillness, an anchor no words could provide. Word traveled quietly. Another veteran came, then another. Marcus Mac Delaney arrived in late August, a wiry man in his 50s with arms corded from years of labor, but eyes lined from drink. His hair was wiry black gone to salt, his voice quick and defensive, as if every word might need defending with fists. He carried the smell of whiskey, though his hands shook as though even that comfort had turned against him. "Don't want charity," he growled the first night. Ethan met his stare without flinching. "Then you'll get work, roof beams ready for your hands." Mac cursed under his breath, but the next morning he was on the roof beside Ethan, hammering with the precision of a man who once built houses before the war took him. Max didn't trust him at first, ears back, tail low, but when Mac, exhausted, slumped against the porch and shared a strip of jerky from his pocket, the dog leaned his head against his knee. Something thawed in Mac's eyes, a spark of humor long buried. By autumn, 3 men lived off and on at the cabin, sleeping on cots Ethan had built from timber and rope. They worked together by day, cutting wood, repairing beams, fishing the creek, and by night they spoke in fragments, sometimes not at all. Silence was not a problem here. Silence was medicine. Mary returned now and then, her red parka flashing between trees, bringing supplies and the kind of blunt advice only a woman who'd outlived storms could give. She laughed at their half-straight walls and corrected their wood stacks with the authority of experience. "You're building more than shelter," she told them one evening, sipping tea by the fire. "You're building yourselves back." Max became the soul of the place. He greeted each newcomer with the unspoken judgment only dogs give, tail wag or tail still, ears forward or ears tight. And each man, hardened and haunted, softened under his gaze. When Calvin woke, shaking in the night, Max climbed onto his cot uninvited and pressed his weight against him until the tremors eased. When Mac muttered bitter curses, Max shoved a paw onto his leg as if to silence the ghosts. Ethan often caught himself smiling at these small acts, realizing they were doing more healing than any sermon could. The notebook grew thicker. Ethan filled page after page, diagrams of cabins, notes on food preservation, stories of mistakes turned into lessons. The men began adding their own lines, Calvin writing about fishing knots, Max sketching out a water filter from gravel and cloth. It became a communal ledger, their scars turned into instruction. By winter, the cabin was no longer a solitary refuge. It was something larger, a center, small but alive, for men who had run out of roads. They called it many things: the Ridge, Walker's Place, the Shack. Ethan didn't care. He only knew it had become more than his survival. It had become theirs. On a late evening, With the sun bleeding gold across the Appalachians, Ethan stood on the porch he had built with hands that once trembled in despair. Mac sat at his side, fur glowing in the light, ears perked toward the valley. Calvin split wood in the yard, steady and sure. Mac was repairing the fishing nets, humming under his breath for the first time in years. Mary was due back in a week, bringing seeds for spring planting. Ethan looked at the horizon, then down at Mac's. The shepherd gazed back, eyes steady, tail sweeping once against the boards. Ethan reached to scratch behind his ears, his voice soft, nearly lost in the wind. "We found it, boy," he whispered. "We found home." The mountains held their silence, but in that silence was an answer. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't thunderbolts in the sky, but the quiet mercies God plants in our path. A loyal dog who refuses to give up on you, a roof rebuilt from ruins, or a stranger who speaks the right words at the right time. Ethan thought he had lost everything, yet in the wilderness he discovered the truth. God can take broken men and broken homes and turn them into sanctuaries of hope. And the same is true for us. In our daily lives, miracles often come hidden as small acts of love, steady companionship, or the strength to endure one more day. They remind us that even when the world says we're finished, heaven says our story has just begun. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that God still works in silence and in storms. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how faith has carried you through your own valleys. And don't forget to subscribe so more souls can find encouragement in stories like this one. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones, keep you safe in every storm, and grant you peace as steady as the mountains and as enduring as His love.